Hello everybody, Jeremy Dickinson here. Hope everybody's doing great. In this video I want to spend some time talking about utilitarianism. I'll talk a little bit about the theory of utilitarianism in general terms, and then I want to talk about two of the main kinds of utilitarianisms that you'll find out there. One kind is called act-utilitarianism, another kind is called rule-utilitarianism, and I'll explain what their differences are after laying the conceptual framework for thinking about utilitarianism as a general ethical theory. Okay, so utilitarianism is a theory of right action. It tells us what feature an action has that makes it the right one, and just put very plainly, in very slogan form, the theory would have it that our duty or the right action is the one that promotes happiness for all those who are going to be affected by our action. So the slogan form would be promote happiness for all, where all can be properly qualified in particular circumstances. So utilitarianism is a kind of consequentialist theory. So a consequentialist theory has it that that the rightness of an action is determined by the consequences that come from the action. So the right action is going to be the one that brings about good consequences. So in general slogan form, the theory of consequentialism is promote the good, or the goods as the case may be. And of course, when we think about these theories, we should be thinking that that wrong action is going to be cashed out in terms of bad consequences. So you do the wrong thing when you promote the bad, or the bads as the case may be. So utilitarianism is a particular kind of consequentialism. It's the most common form there is. Another kind of consequentialism, just to round things out here, is known as egoism. So one can be an egoist by maintaining that the right thing to do is to promote one's own good. The wrong thing to do is to promote the things that are bad for a person. And so there's a contrast within consequentialism between egoistic theories of consequentialism and utilitarian theories. So the utilitarian theories say that when we promote happiness for all, it isn't for the sake of my own happiness. When we're talking about happiness for all, the happiness of others truly matters, and it's our obligation, it's our duty to secure the happiness of others. Where on an egoistic view, the goal is to promote the good for oneself and oneself only. Okay, and you promote the good of others only insofar as it would promote your own good. Okay, so so utilitarianism, the most common form of consequentialism, and utilitarianism, again, in just slogan form, so we understand it, is promote happiness for all. Okay, what does all mean here? Well, it certainly means all sentient beings, at least according to typical utilitarians. So any being that's capable of experiencing happiness is a relevant subject to moral consideration according to utilitarianism. So that's why you'd find, for example, it often argued that animals need to be treated better, or that they have rights, by utilitarian philosophers, because they're the kinds of beings that can be happy or can experience happiness to some degree or other. And so insofar as utilitarianism is traditionally developed, utilitarians will often include any entity that is capable of having feelings. Okay, so that's a rough sense of what utilitarianism is. So the thing that we look to when we look to doing the right thing is what's going to bring about happiness for all of those affected by our actions. And a couple different ways you could go. You can say that the goal is to maximize happiness. Other theories would have it that you don't have to maximize, but you have to generally promote or bring about enough happiness. Okay, so that's utilitarianism. Um, as I said, there's two different kinds of utilitarianism. We oftentimes call them nowadays act and rule utilitarianism. The philosopher J.J.C. Smart, in a work called Extreme and Restricted Utilitarianism, refers to rule utilitarianism as extreme utilitarianism, and the restricted version as rule utilitarianism. And in that famous work, Smart argues that the extreme view is to be preferred to the restricted view. So he ends up arguing for what we nowadays call act-utilitarianism. Okay, so what's the difference between these kinds of utilitarianism? Well, thinking about the act-utilitarian view, it's probably the more common of the views out there among utilitarians. It's the view that in every particular circumstance, our obligation is to bring about happiness for all those affected by our actions. And we're to do this even if doing so would violate a general moral rule. And it's important to note here that for the utilitarian, the most general, the most important, the fundamental moral rule that we have is to promote happiness. But the utilitarian generally says that from that very general principle, we can derive other principles of lesser generality. So they could say that we have the duty in most ordinary cases not to lie, when we have the duty not to cheat, another duty not to steal, etc. And they'll say that these duties hold when they do, most of the time, because they're derived from the utilitarian principle of promoting happiness for all. And so the utilitarian, whether it's an act utilitarian or rule utilitarian, is going to say that this is true. So we have the very general rule utilitarianism gives us, promote happiness for all, and then we are able to derive duties, other moral duties. So the act utilitarian is saying that in every particular circumstance we have to promote happiness for all, even if doing so conflicts with a particular moral rule that we derived from the utilitarian principle. So that's act utilitarianism. The rule utilitarian, on the other hand, argues that we're to promote happiness for all, but we need to always follow the derived moral rule, even if in the particular circumstance that we're acting, we're not going to promote the happiness for all. And the idea here must be something like this. By following the moral rule, we keep the institutions associated with our rules properly in place, and they won't be weakened. If these rules are weakened, then it's very likely that they're going to lead to, or that the fact that they're broken is going to lead to unhappiness. So breaking moral rules is something that will, in the long run, lead to more unhappiness. And so we should always follow the moral rule. Again, even if in a particular circumstance we won't bring about the most happiness for all those affected by our actions, of course. So that's just the rough sketch of the difference between the views. Let's see if we can understand them through the use of examples. So the act utilitarian says, look, I grant that moral rules are very important, but we need to keep in mind that they're rules of thumb that guide our behaviors for the most part. But we always need to keep in mind that as utilitarians, we believe that our job, our duty, the right actions are the ones that correspond with promoting happiness for all. The act-utilitarian says that these moral rules can be good, in particular in cases where we have time constraints, um, where we're in a situation where we can't properly um, determine what the best outcome is going to be in a circumstance. And so, for example, if we see someone drowning in a pool of water, we don't have time to calculate whether or not saving that person's life is going to promote the most happiness, then the best thing to do in most cases is just jump in and save the person's life who's drowning. Now, imagine someone jumps in a circumstance like this, and it turns out that that person saves Adolf Hitler in the 1930s in Germany. Well, the act-utilitarian, in that circumstance would say, it looks like you've done the wrong thing, but you should be praised morally for having followed the rule that is normally the one to be followed. So here we see the act-utilitarian say that the rightness of an action and the praise associated with the action in question can pull apart. So in the drowning case, when it's Adolf Hitler, the wrong thing has been done because, of course, Hitler goes on and murders millions of people. But still, you as an agent can be praised because you weren't aware of the fact that that was Hitler, and you performed an action that is typically in line with following a moral rule, and that's typically good. So the act-utilitarian is saying, yeah, the moral rule is good in cases where we have time constraints, and so in the drowning case, we should just follow the moral rule in most cases. Of course, if we know that that's Hitler, all bets are off. Now, another kind of case that the act-utilitarians would recognize where rules are important would be cases where we're likely to be biased. We're naturally pretty self-interested, and we're likely to be biased in our favor in many cases. So imagine a case like divorce. This is another example from J.J.C. Smart. The drowning example is also from his work that I've mentioned earlier. But this case involving divorce is also his. So we're likely to be partial in cases like divorce. Maybe we're unhappy in our marriage, and so what we're likely to do in these circumstances, in order to justify or try to rationalize to ourselves why it's permissible or okay for us to get a divorce, we're going to say things like, well, our happiness is just so bad, and so we're likely to overstate our unhappiness, and we're likely to overstate the unhappiness of our loved ones that will be affecting, say, our partners and our children. But the act-utilitarian can recognize that the general rule, stay married, is very important because it leads to a lot of happiness, or at least it can very often lead to more happiness in society. So we have to be careful that we don't weaken that rule and thereby weaken that institution. So the act-utilitarian is going to say, in cases where there's personal bias, it's good that there are these rules in place that we should just generally follow. And that's not to say that there aren't cases where it would be permissible for someone to get a divorce. That's not the claim. The claim is just we have to be sure that we're assessing things properly, that we're calculating the amount of unhappiness and the amount of happiness to see that we are producing the best overall outcome, or the outcome that in the circumstance is good enough. Okay, so that's a bit of how act-utilitarianism will deal with moral rules, and they're going to say that you can violate these moral rules, but only in cases where you're pledging your allegiance, if you will, to the fundamental principle of utilitarianism, which is to promote happiness for all in every particular circumstance. That's why Smart calls this the extreme view. It's extreme to hold such a view about utilitarianism. Okay, so let me stop here and begin a new video where I talk a bit more about rule utilitarianism. Okay, more soon.